The piece is called Safe Conduct, and it's a 3-channel and 1 audioscape piece. The 3 videos are installed on big sort of airport video wall things hanging in a slightly oppressive way in the center of the room. And then around that are a series of speakers playing Ravel's Bolero. I would treat it like a ballet in a way, but a very, very strange one. That's sort of the rhythm of security in airports. Particularly inspired by those kind of safety animations and security animations that you'll see when you're queuing up to the passport or whatever, or to drop your stuff through security, which have a very particular kind of whimsical tone, very it's sort of innocent, this idea, when actually, what's really happening when you have to take everything off and go through these machines and stuff is quite, to my mind at least, symbolically quite a violent thing. And that passing through borders, I suppose I wanted to kind of figure around that, work around that as a kind of metaphorical world. So within the film, there's quite a lot more visceral stuff happens in the equivalent of a security space. So the figure is often trying to put things in security trays to go down the carousel, but those things might be bits of guts, blood, bones, but also a laptop, So it's this sort of, I suppose the best way to describe it might be like a computer-generated slapstick horror ballet security video. The figures that I'm using in this and that I've been using for a while now are computer-generated. They're often described as avatars, but to my mind, and particularly for the sake of this work, I would better call them surrogates. And I think that this is something that's happening in those security videos in airports, the animations, is that if you actually had a live action version of that, there is something it would be too obvious about the kind of violence that people have to go through, or the stress, or the anxiety, and the paranoia, all of these very negative kind of connotations. But if you have a kind of cartoon, funny guy sort of removing his watch and putting it in the thing, suspension of disbelief, the kind of illusion of the whole thing is allowed to continue. And I think what I want to be able to speak of is a reality, but pushed through its representation. And that representation is precisely the place where the politics of representation starts, or what it is to show and to speak of something, when it's not there, I suppose, and what kind of arises there. Sometimes I worry that the work pretends that there is this kind of identity crisis of white, straight, Western masculinity, which I don't think it is. Probably it is, in some way. But I also feel like so much of the work is based on archetypes and stereotypes and caricature and standardization and the violence of that and the processes that happen through a kind of both literal and figurative determination of identity or of subject or self or any of that sort of work, and the ways in which technologies, which are not, technologies aren't benign things. They're invented by and bought by and developed by industrial military complex kind of worlds. So all of these things, the very fact that the models that you can buy, the 3D models that you can buy are white figures, the most detailed ones. And the ones that aren't are like versions of that made darker or like changed a bit. So there is this extraordinary horror involved in the world of the CGI, which is that everything gets pushed into very convenient boxes, which are extraordinarily inauthentic and yet predicated on the appearance of authenticity. So they have to look really convincing, and yet they only convince of one thing, and that one thing is a sort of horrible convincingness. They just convince of themselves. It's a sort of self-annihilating horror show, I think. I've always wanted to have to make a piece where the music is just as it is. You know, the re-performance or the replaying of it. Not that it's a music video, but that it sets the tone. And the Bolero is such a unique piece. It's such a, I mean, it's, you know, probably the most famous piece of music in the world or something, you know, and probably the most used. It's intensely familiar to a point of almost being eradicated. In the same way that if I repeat the same word over and over again, it starts to lose meaning. And yet what's interesting about the Bolero is that it was sort of made like that. So Ravel always said that it's not really a piece of music, it's a texture for an orchestra. So it's almost a way of pressing demo on orchestra, you know. It's like, we hear that bit, and I mean, it's closer to like, I don't know, a Peter and the Wolf or a young person's guide to the orchestra or something like that, you know. Insofar as it just repeats, there's sort of 1 minute loop for this lot of the orchestra, and then so it has this. There's also speculation about his increasing dementia when he wrote it, and there's a condition, a symptom of dementia is the desire for repetition, for affirmation, and there is something the re-rehearsing, the eternal rehearsal of something, rather than the thing in itself. So the kind of uniqueness of an experience that's unrepeatable is unavailable to the artwork. To all artworks, you know, all artworks, regardless of their liveness, have the kind of rehearsed aspect to them. And it's something I really want in the work that's sort of inherent in the structure of everything. Is rhythm, is rehearsal, is the rise and fall of meaning and effect, you know. So in the same way that one idea about music would be that, you know, in order for it to affect you, you have to know it once. You have to have heard it once already to understand the full size of the structure. This idea of the golden section would only be apprehensible if you already knew this amount, and then you could work out that this was the percentage at which you would suddenly be affected. There's often a chorus in the work as well, where you can sort of join in a way, in your head, you know. But obviously the Bolero is a shortcut to the eternal chorus. It's just a chorus, it's just this thing that is so known. And I feel like familiarity is the ground upon which one can either break massively and destroy familiarity and consensus and all of those more insidious kind of appearances. Or you can build. And allowing the Bolero to just be in its entirety, I think, at this stage, felt like a really important, you know, when you make, sometimes the decisions that you make, the bigger and the more sort of apparently fundamental, which they don't really carry the nuance of meaning yet. They just have this kind of, you know, no, and when you make that promise to the work, like you're not going to touch the Bolero, because I usually edit the hell out of everything, but this, just play it, you know. If you see the same thing again, difference lies elsewhere than the work. So repetition is a way of, I suppose, is a way of putting the emphasis back on the audience as a kind of interpreting thing, people, insofar as obviously every time you see it, time for you and everything has changed, or it's accrued, or it's changed in some way, you know. So the third time he pulls off his face, it's like a joke, you know. It's something gets repeated over and over again. It's sort of not funny, and then it's hilarious, and then it's, you know, it's this extraordinary, like boredom kicks in as well. And what is he doing? If you do it once, it has kind of shock. When you do it again, you're building a texture. It's very, I love it, you know. Also, it has this kind of insistence. Yeah, repetition. Who doesn't like it, really, you know? There's a great Fall song about that, about repetition. The models come, when you buy them, they come immaculate, you know, perfect. I mean, or just as perfect, you know, they look sort of like a model from the 90s or something, you know. Yeah. I mean, insofar as this is a kind of traditional idea, I suppose, and an idea around abjection is where, you know, I don't think about my hands or my fingers working until they break. You know, so if someone cuts off my fingers, I'm aware I don't have fingers. It's in the breakdown of something that it becomes more. And I feel like the CG becomes more CG, the more fucked up it is. You know, the more broken down he looks, the more you're aware that he's a fake thing. Because it pushes against the idea of what computer generation is for, even, which usually you would expect it to be about perfecting something or about getting something, doing something that reality can't do. So in movies, obviously, we're used to it showing off the most amazing over-the-top stuff, aliens and dinosaurs or whatever, things that it would be impossible to do in reality. Whereas to have a guy looking a bit beaten up, there's some sort of horrible purposelessness to that. Like, why, you know, what did he do? He's not even a he. I mean, what's the, you know, there's some sort of horrible pointlessness. And that pointlessness speaks to a kind of reality, I suppose. The kind of reality where things just look like things, you know. Where I look like this and not right, you know. Or my teeth are brown, they're not white, you know, whatever. So he's gone through something. It's also this idea that he has a history. Something has happened to, you know, and now from this sort of point where potentially sort of the idea of stopping making computer-generated videos, I've been doing it for long enough now to have this strange sense of history of sort of about it. But then to have that kind of moved into the diegesis of the work, where in the world of the film, something's happened to him. It's very peculiar. But I like that feeling of a lived-in CGI man, you know. I've wanted to make a piece called Safe Conduct for a long time. Ever since I read an autobiographical book by Boris Pasternak. I would call it an autobiography, but it's not really. It's sort of a non-chronological, aphoristic, very vivid chunks from his life. Sorry. Safe conduct is also it's a document that would be given to someone to allow them safe passage, you know, during wartime or during states of exception, or would be gifted by whichever states and agreed upon to allow someone to travel. It's a privilege, basically, which felt like, it seems like quite an anachronistic term somehow, safe conduct. It has the kind of horrible flat line of official language, you know. And I think that part of the problem of the title somehow, it has this extraordinary ambivalence about, is that a directive? Is that something outside of this? Is that telling me to do something? Is that a question, or, you know, safe conduct? Or is it like a blessing? It's definitely something from the outside, and I think in the same way that the security protocol works, the instructional, you know, do this, and you know, the consequences of not doing it are never revealed, but you know what they are. You know, you would be disallowed from being a citizen, from being a human. So in a way, safe conduct sort of occupies this, hopefully, a kind of critical place. The Pasternak thing has kind of disappeared a little bit in the making of the work, but I still feel like that's in there, and some of the text is in there is very directly inspired by him and his life. I also feel like actually Pasternak's approach to autobiography has the flavor and the vividness of something that I've been trying to do for a long time, which is to kind of I don't believe in autobiography, and the work I've made has never been directly autobiographical, but what it is to speak of autobiography rather than to actually make one. So Pasternak haunts the whole thing, totally and explicitly in the title. But the title is also I think is detached enough, and I think it relates very clearly to the tone of the installation in there as well. The fact that these giant screens are sort of bearing down on you like an all-seeing, it's slightly panopticon-y kind of surveillance kind of instrument somehow. It also just has a great rhythm to it.